I just want to welcome participants here in South Africa, Cape Town, following a two-day program of knowledge and sharing and learning around the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which was a event focused around South Africa, but also involved discussions and exchange between Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Nigeria, Senegal, and other international participants and South African participants. So we have a sort of concluding session for the 2 days. So we are holding a special global dialogue with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the title of which is South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership, a model for climate financing for Africa. And it's a real pleasure as Executive Director, my name is Salim Fakir, to co-host this with the Africa Program Director for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Zainab Usman, who writes on many things, particularly on economic transformation. And she's been observing very closely Just Energy Transition Partnership, not only in South Africa, and I know you've written on South Africa, but she's written it from a point of view of its relevance for the rest of Africa. And I know, Zainab, you've made lots of observations over the last 2 days, and I'm going to hand over the session to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salim. Good evening to those in the room. Hello from Cape Town to those joining us online. Welcome to this special Global Dialogue session of the JET Knowledge Exchange and Learning Sessions. We at the Africa Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace are very thrilled to be in South Africa for this important event. And I definitely want to thank Salim Fakir and the entire team at the Africa Climate Foundation, and also South Africa's Presidential Climate Commission for these very productive, in-depth, and dynamic conversations that we've had over the past 2 days. We are very excited to co-host this Global Dialogue session. We know there are many people joining us from around the world, very much interested in this topic. So, as Salim mentioned, my name is Zainab Usman, the founding director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we are based in Washington, D.C. We are perhaps the oldest think tank in the US, but the Africa Program is itself fairly new. We're about 1.5 years old. We are therefore very much aware of the urgent need for African-led analysis to inform policy on the continent, but also very importantly to shape the thinking of Africa's major external partners, from the United States to countries in Europe to those in Asia, to better understand the risks, but also the immense opportunities that the low-carbon transition presents for countries in Africa and indeed other parts of the world. So in this global dialogue that we're having right now, we hope to help further connect the dots for our specialists in the room, and there are quite a number of you, in linking South Africa's JETP to broader climate action worldwide. But very importantly, we also want to involve the public in this discussion. So I'd like to provide a very short introduction to the topic, because not everyone, especially people joining us from around the world, really understand JETP and some of the intricacies and why it matters really for climate action worldwide. The JETP was negotiated between South Africa and Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union as one of the most notable outcomes of the COP26 summit in Glasgow last year, to support South Africa's phase-out of coal-fired energy production. While it is primarily oriented that goal, the JETP also aims to help diversify the economy of South Africa, create jobs, but also to support industries like electric vehicles and green hydrogen. The commitment, which is something that made a lot of headlines around the world, of $8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years to support this transition for Africa's largest emitter, is important not just in its own right, not just because of the the figure itself and the timelines, but also as a very interesting model for how other emerging market economies can access financing to facilitate their own transitions. Plans for similar JETPs are with India, with Indonesia, with Senegal, and Vietnam have been announced. And we are indeed very honored to have delegations from some of these countries present with us today. Given that other countries are looking to follow South Africa's model, there are also questions around how vulnerable countries around the world with less clout, not everyone is a South Africa or an Indonesia or a Senegal, you think of small island countries, whether in the Caribbean or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, as well as fragile economies, low-income countries around the world. You think of where they stand in all of this. They do not have the clout to perhaps negotiate such deals. So to engage with these issues, I have here with me distinguished friends, colleagues from around the world. To begin with, joining us virtually is Fatena Gad. She's a senior advisor on climate diplomacy and geopolitics at the African Climate Foundation, and she'll be giving some closing remarks. But in person, we're also delighted to have here with us Rudy Dix, Head of Project Management Office in the Presidency of the Republic of South Africa. Then we have Ido Mahendra, who is a Special Advisor to the Coordinating Minister for Maritime and Investment Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia, whom he advises on policies around the energy transition, carbon pricing, and maritime sector industrialization. We also have Fatou Sow, who's the Planning and Studies Unit Lead at the Ministry of Oil and Energy in Senegal. She is responsible for coordinating the development of energy policy, as well as Senegal's energy information system. And finally, as you know, we have Salim Fakir, the Executive Director of the Africa Climate Foundation. So over the next 1 hour or so, we're just going to have a dialogue with all of the individuals here, and then we'll open up for questions from our online audience and also for those of you who are here with us in person. So let me start with Rudy. Over the past 2 days, we've had intensive discussions around that kind of went the full spectrum from how the background and preparatory work was done before the announcement was made of the JETP in November last year, to some of the implementation arrangements, to next steps. So can you kind of summarize for our audience what those preparatory processes were, and then how the specific objectives of JETP align with South Africa's broader economic strategy?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question. Of course, let's start off firstly by some of the fundamental decisions that we've taken around transition and climate transition. And South Africa and its government has been pursuing that quite vigorously so in the last few years. More specifically, some of the specific legislation and policy choices around climate transition, our commitments that have been taken at a cabinet decision on our nationally determined contribution, those ambitious targets that we've set with the UNFCCC set us up for a process where we committed ourselves to a transition that is going to be important, a transition that is interlinked to sustainable economic growth. And that's fundamental. So we don't see climate transition as a separate dichotomy from economic growth and development. It is integrated, and it has to be. So many times you think of it as an add-on. It's like, okay, don't forget the question about just transition and climate change issues when you talk about economic growth and particularly some of the indicators around investment and around employment and broadly so. So it has to be part of that entire framing of how we see sustainable growth going forward. And making that ambitious announcements on the national determined contribution set us up for an engagement with the international partner group that you've highlighted in approaching us and saying to us, well, we like the decisions that you've made as part of our commitment towards funding transitions. We're prepared to offer you an X amount of money to be able to fund that. Now, that, of course, set into motion a negotiated process, and, of course, it resulted into a political declaration that is there. The negotiation process in itself was a technically different process, led by the IPG group, and, of course, the UK government was the lead in that. We had a number of different departments from our side being part of that conversation as to getting to that. So it was a very interesting conversation to be able to get to that. Lots of important principles, because that's important for us in the lessons learned, that if you don't set out the rules, if you don't set out what clear objectives you want to establish, and for example, let me give a good example of this. Initially, the conversation was only around decarbonization and coal, as you put it, coal phase out. And we felt that while GHG emissions through electricity production is 45% of our total GHG emissions, so it's quite high. Anything you do in electricity around sustainability would immediately cut across the entire economy. But we also felt there were important sectors of our economy, given that we are a relatively diversified economy, right? And growing more in those kind of different spaces was the issue around electric vehicles, for example. Also the development of green hydrogen and the technology around green hydrogen, and all its different aspects of it, right? And of course, a very difficult conversation, but eventually the political declaration was fairly clear around the principles of supporting three aspects of our transition. The last point that I just wanted to make was that I think that 8.5 billion in the bigger scheme of the transitions that we need now, we can throw around and bandy any sort of numbers. It's just a small portion of it, and that's why I think it's important to know that there's no commitment to fully fund the transition, the climate transition in South Africa. That's an ongoing conversation. That's a commitment that we would have to give. That's a commitment that we'd expect to negotiate with a number of other development partners, other countries that may come along. But it's quite important for us that we've taken that first step. We've taken that risk. We've taken that first step. We've asked and negotiated a commitment for 3 to 5 years. That is part of a partnership that I think it's going to be important for us to develop into the future as we move towards net zero. So quite critically involved in that. What makes it more interesting and important is that the way the 8.5 billion will be disbursed and spent was on the basis that we've agreed to develop an investment plan, for sustainable growth. So we're in the process of finalizing an investment plan on the basis of the JETP that could be a blueprint for South Africa, and this is the important thing. So whether we had a JETP or not, the interesting thing of developing an investment plan that shows a sustainable future is quite an important thing for us.
And when will this investment plan be unveiled? Will it be publicly available as well?
Well, we're hoping to target COP, right?
COP,
so again, it depends on the approval process, because it has to go through a government process. It has to be approved by ministers. It has to be approved by cabinet. As you know, of course, we've entered into a lot of consultation with different stakeholders around this. So it is a process that you'd have to follow to ensure that, again, we take everybody along and everybody is happy with it, But at the end of the day, cabinet has to sign off on it. So we're hoping to earmark that, but I'm just saying that, there's a lot of work that still needs to get done for it to be approved and to be adopted.
Excellent. So before I bring in other colleagues on the panel, a follow-up question to you then is, you hinted at the involvement of different entities and agencies, and I wonder if you could explain to us what institutional mechanisms have been set up so far.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, what was nice, so in the way that we've developed the JETP, there was a two-pronged process. The first was negotiating the political declaration, and so that was up until COP26, where we announced on the sidelines of COP, that political declaration. That in itself sent into motion a negotiated process, right? Because you needed to unflesh those details. What is the cost of capital? What component would be concessional? What component would be grants? Is it linked to an investment plan? Is it linked to what's particular areas of focus that we need to look at? How do we look at the just component? What mechanisms are we implementing in terms of flow of capital into the, so many questions, as you can imagine, that was there. And of course, what we needed to do firstly is to set up a negotiating process. We established what is referred to as the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, headed by Mr. Maneli, Daniel Maneli, and the PMO team have supported him in ensuring that we can get through the negotiations and some of the technical process that is there. Outside of that, so you have your counterparty on the other end, which is again the IPG group led by the UK government that has set up a negotiating team. So and very much the same kind of negotiating. The interesting dynamic, we set up another structure to assist us around the technical aspects and to do some of the work for us, in which is a JETP secretariat, and that's headed by Ms. Joanne Yawich, South African, who has been appointed and supported the work of both the international partner group and the South African delegation that's leading the negotiations. So this given spin-off to a whole lot of different structures that are important. Equally, I think what has also been critical is that we've been able to work with different supporting organizations. Salim's organizations as the African Climate Foundation. The PCC, our sister organization in the presidency, that is a consultative body that has been able to work. Engaging with different departments and different entities. Organizations, social partner, for example, our social dialogue structures that are there. So you're finding all these different mechanisms playing an important role in molding and designing the importance of inputting into a process. At the end of the day, I think it's the nature of our society in South Africa, and that's something that I think many can learn, that we take inputs, we consult, we do a lot of work around some of these things, and that's been quite critical. I must also just say many of the research and the technical structures that are out there provide important work for us on modeling, for example, when we finally launch the document, the modeling work on the technical aspects, on areas of costing, of where the interventions would be, also has played an important role. But primarily guided by the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. The one aspect, sorry, just in closing, the one other aspect that's quite important is that I made this point that early on that the success of a JETP in the way that we've designed it is our strong interface politically. So with ministers and the president, and that's very, very important. Because technical people can get into negotiations and negotiate their lives away, right? But if you have a very poor political buying or understanding, you tend to run the risk of having a disjuncture between what the technocrats do and what ministers or the president do. And we've been able to set up what is referred to in South African terms an interministerial committee of ministers relevant to this process. And there are about 6 ministers from environment to public enterprises to national treasury to minerals, resources, and energy, coordinated by the minister in the presidency, Minister Mondli Gungubele. And so that's important. So we are not simply going in with negotiations without having an adequate mandating structure that's politically driven, because it's quite important that you have that. And this is an important lesson for us, and how we've been able to deal with the negotiations where there's continuous interface between ourselves and the technical team, ourselves and the political team, which is led by the minister in the presidency, Minister Gungubele.
Great, wonderful. I want to bring in Salim now. As the head of the African Climate Foundation, an organization that is non-profit, how consultative would you say this process has been?
Sure.
Since the time of the negotiation of the initial deal and all of the actions that have been taken so far?
So I think we shouldn't we have to recognize there's a history of consultation around the just transition. For example, the National Planning Commission, led actually by Tasneem Essop, yeah, the most consultative person I know of, who works now for CANA, Climate Action Network, she was a commissioner, ran a process around the just transition, pulled together quite a diverse process, highly consultative around the just transition, which actually laid the groundwork, I think it's 2015, it's also in the National Planning Commission. There's a bit of history that people forget. In fact, quite widespread consultation. Then there was the Job Summit, 2018. That was a highly consultative process, involved different stakeholders. The president was presented with the thought of actually setting up a climate commission to actually support and facilitate yet another layer of consultation, right? Because there's this myth that there was no consultation on any of these things. It's just weird. If you just look at the history, like the selective amnesia sometimes people have. And if you look at what the PCC has done, which we support, in fact, the government should be supporting more. I can say that here on the platform. That runs a very highly consultative process. It has no option because it's constructed like that. It has 20 commissioners, it has ministers, it has civil society representative, and many of them, even in civil society, have to consult with their constituencies, business, labor unions. I'm not sure the municipalities, we're still thinking about them. And that structure, in fact, it's almost a replication of NEDLAC, if I'm not mistaken. That structure has a multi-stakeholder process by design. And it has to agree, I think Valley said sufficient consensus. That's the word that he used. It was a CODESA process. Deepak would remember that. And they've had a lot of consultation around the entire framework of how the PCC works, the business plan of the PCC, the Just Transition Framework. All of that is the background for the Just Energy Transition Partnership. We should remember that. And I think the challenge we have is that we agreed on the framework, on the partnership in Glasgow. Everybody knows there was a delay for close to 4 months, I think, 5 months. Then the special or Apex envoy who was tasked to run this process had to very quickly get on his feet, put a team together, and start the process of the negotiation. I think we had this idea of the investment, and actually it's a question I wanted to ask Rudy. Why did we not just call it a framework instead of an investment plan? Because it's not really an investment plan. As I understand, I haven't read your document. I don't even have access to it, by the way. So I just understand that...
You'll get it when everybody else gets it.
Exactly, and then I will be consulted as well. That document doesn't have a pipeline that says X amount of money. It's a ballpark figure. I understand that's what you were saying in the last 2 days.
Actually, slightly more detailed.
Oh, slightly more detailed.
Yeah, slightly more detailed.
Yeah, we're all looking forward to reading this document.
I think there's an undertaking. I think there's almost an obligation by the presidency and through the PCC. There's been some prior consultations already. In fact, I've seen the reports. You had with labor, business. In fact, you were supposed to have one tomorrow.
Youth, religious organizations.
Religious
social
organizations.
organizations.
Even communities. So we have to recognize that things have been done at that level. We now have to, there's an obligation on the presidency to open that, the investment plan has to be released and consulted. It's a government process. It's not only one particular group that needs to be consulted, there's 10 other groups. This is how it works in South Africa, complicated country.
Okay.
Zainab. So these are processes that are ongoing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now let's bring in our friends from Senegal and Indonesia, because these are countries that are actively having conversations with partners around the world for similar initiatives. Based on what we have heard of South Africa's experience, what could a JETP look like for Senegal and Indonesia? And I'm going to start with you, Fatou. What will constitute the core of such an energy transition plan for Senegal? And how might such a JETP conceptualize the future of the most carbon-intensive sectors? And here I'm thinking about Senegal's new gas resources and gas production.
Thank you so much, Zainab. JETP for Senegal will for sure include our socio-economic development priorities in the energy sector first, the priority of access to universal access to affordable, reliable energy for households and for businesses. And also, it will include our engagement related to the climate and to the climate change. It will also include the, all we have like objective in the socio-economic development. I've said it in the last session. We have a very young population. And you said it, since 2014, Senegal discovered gas and oil. But our economy, since Senegal exists, doesn't rely on natural resources. So it's a chance we have. So we have the possibility to develop an energy transition and also transitioning our economy. Our national economic development have also objective in transitioning our economy. And in one session here, we heard about the necessity of value added for African economy. And this JETP must be an opportunity also to develop the economy and to have benefit to develop new businesses for our people. And if we lack to do that, the energy transition won't be a success. So it must be a mix of climate objective, but also of economic and socio-economic development objective. It will necessarily, so Senegal is a low contributor to the GHG emission. It's quite different from South Africa. We know that in South Africa, the energy system is based on coal. Our energy system is based on fossil fuel, but we have renewable energy, hydro, solar, and wind. And this is an opportunity. Now we have gas. We'll develop our gas and the power system based on gas, because energy transition is also about energy security. And the context of the crisis we have has shown us that energy security is important. Yeah. Countries can switch from a transition to another when we have crisis. So this energy security is very important in our next JETP, and we are discussing with partners, and the South African experience is very useful for us. Even the context is different, but challenges are the same.
Edo, I want to bring you in. Same question. What will a JETP look like for Indonesia? What will the key components of the energy transition plan be? And potentially, if you could walk us through what a potential ask could be for financing from external partners.
Thank you, Zainab, for the question. So basically, Indonesia is just recently embarking in this journey towards the energy transition. So we are currently in the process of the negotiations, discussion, talks with our IPG partners through our JETP JET partnership, which is co-led by the US and Japan. So in a way that we are like a year behind South Africa in terms of the process. The thing that we can, the philosophy of the energy transition, the just energy transition for Indonesia is basically, it should be part of our decarbonization efforts at the national level, countrywide, because when country grows, the traditional path is always like it will be energy intensive growth. That what has been happening, that what has happened in the past 100 years, you know, the process of industrialization, so that countries become more advanced, they become more industrialized, and Indonesia would like to break that path. So it is important, one fundamental philosophy is we want to transition to a low carbon economy. We want to decarbonize, and energy is part of that. The energy transition is a chunk, a piece of puzzle that is integral, that needs to be there so that we can reach our goal to have a low carbon economy, to decarbonize our country. That's one thing. Now, the second thing, what kind of energy transition that we would like to have? The second philosophy is like energy security and affordability is non-negotiable. So the end game should be those two. So we want to make sure that our energy security is well guarded, and the transitioning towards these cleaner, renewable energies is affordable for our people. Because if it's not affordable, then it's not just. Because it has to be affordable to Indonesians that live in the most remote area in the country. So that two things, that is the second part, energy security and affordability. So the third thing is, I think it's also, we learn a lot from South Africa as well, that, and it's been mentioned during this event, 2 days event repeatedly, the importance of country ownership and, you know, a country-led JET program or JET partnership, which is so that, you know, everyone's buying in. Because, you know, even domestically, you know, we are, in the process, we are negotiating with our partners, IPG members. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders within the country, our brothers and sisters, they are heard. And that is not, that is not, I mean, it's easier said than done. And I think South Africa is doing a good job. I take it from from Salim and from Rudy. I take it that way. So
don't praise us too much.
so I think that is important part as well. And what are the asks? So it is important that you know, for all developing countries, look, the traditional growth path is always energy hungry, energy intensive, and these have been enjoyed by some countries, and some others have not enjoyed it. I'm sure none of the countries here represented on this in this stage have been enjoying that. So I like what you said. It's what's called common but differentiated responsibilities. So I think that's the philosophy that all emerging economies, developing countries, have to take into account. I think that's very good. And remember that we are contributing to global public goods. So it means that
is that through the carbon sinks, the forest?
Whatever, energy transition, carbon sinks, all these contribute to global public goods. You know, to make sure that our climate targets that we agreed upon in COP, whatever international negotiations, international forums that we agree can be reached. So that means international community has to provide different types of assistance, because it's a global public goods. So there has to be some elements that could, you know, assist in the provision of these public goods. Otherwise, it will be undersupplied. And this is like public economics 101.
Yeah,
so in order to
compensate it.
Yeah, right. Because if we don't break this traditional growth path, then it's not possible, because this country, we need to grow. right? But now we want to break the traditional path. We want to go to a low carbon way, right? So, and of course we are subject to constraint. And our efforts will contribute to the global public goods. And normally public goods is always undersupplied if there are no proper interventions, in this case from the international community. So I think that's the contextualization of the common but differentiated responsibilities here.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be together here, both, developing countries, no matter what kind of, labels that we want to have. But this is the thing, that it's global public goods. We have to make sure that we have the spirit of this common but differentiated ownership here.
So I want to follow up on something you mentioned about the just aspect of this transition, which has to do with, as you say, affordability of energy. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, the just element, beyond affordable electricity access. Can you contextualize for us, for Indonesia, what this just element means in terms of whether it's jobs for different types of workers, support for specific types of communities, inclusion, etc. What does it really mean within the context of Indonesia? Because we know in South Africa, there's a huge dependence on coal, not just the people who work in the electricity generation power plants, but also the coal mining communities. One estimate puts it at around 90,000 people could potentially be affected. So what does this mean for Indonesia, this justice?
Well, in principle, whatever policy changes always result in winners and losers. And definitely there will be parties that lose from the energy transition. So the just aspect is to make sure, while at the same time, there are also winners here. And there could be from the same groups. So what we have to make sure, especially from the government side, is to make sure that we can make sure that the losers don't really lose that much or that long, so that they can transition as well. Because especially for us, like, that have a long history of being a carbon-based economy, commodity-based economy. 65% of our laborers in the energy sector is actually working in the fossil fuel, so 100,000. So even though we project that there will be quite a significant number of new jobs resulting from the deployment of renewables, but still there will be some losers, and the numbers could be more than a 250,000, for instance. So we need to assist the transition. So we have some programs for that, and it needs to be part of the package energy transition that any country, including Indonesia, is embarking. Because sometimes the thing is, like, sometimes these coal regions, so it's like a symmetric issue. Like, sometimes the deployment of the renewables, not sometimes, maybe most of the time, so also in South Africa. So, like, we have areas that are endowed, rich in carbon, and then the location of the renewables are not there because of economies of scale. And there may be somewhere else. So, and this is a delicate issue that needs proper planning and making sure, because it's not as easy as on paper or on books, because the location is different. So we have to make sure that we also prepare something in that area that is usually heavily carbon. So maybe could be one of the solution is to create a green industry there. So once we invite green industry, they're located in the old carbon regions.
Yeah. So one final question to you before I, sorry, did you
No,
want to say something?
I wanted to just, the just transition is very important for us. I can't emphasize that more Zainab. And in the negotiations of doing the political declaration, and even right now, as we move towards the launch of the investment plan, the just component for us is fundamental. And partly so because I think the point for us is that South Africa has one of the highest inequality rates, right? And that's driven largely by low levels of employment. So it's combined with a young population who is unemployed, and significant number of others who are also unemployed. So you have a relatively high, unemployment rate. Only 1 out of 3 people who working age adults have a job, right? Sorry, 2 out of 3. So this is quite critical for us, because if we're doing a transition of this kind of nature, particularly where there are coal-dependent communities and they're all located in one region of the country, it's important that you not exacerbate an already difficult situation, which is high levels of inequality and unemployment. So that's a plus. You can't, and we've made this very clear in our conversations, there is no way that we're going to do a transition, decarbonize, if we are not able to say to workers, to communities, to small businesses, informal economic activity, that this is the opportunities that are there, or we're going to place you into alternative jobs, right? So it's important that the kind of the method of transition is simply not just we're creating these new sectors. We need to think in a very practical sense of how we get, because it's again the same. So luckily our natural resource endowments around PV is good in Mpumalanga too, but more so in the Northern Cape, which is on the other side of the country, right? So it's important to think about how one geographically deals with a value chain, an entire value chain around coal in one region versus wind on the coast and and PV in the Northern Cape and elsewhere. So these are the kind of complex conversations that we have to have, but it's central in that conversations, and we have to solve for it. So it's not simply you on your own, Zainab. Sorry, man. There's a renewable job somewhere else. Go and sort yourself out, right? I think that's quite important for us, and it's pertinent because you just add to a dire situation already, high levels of inequality driven by high levels of unemployment.
Speaking of helping workers, communities transition to new industries, you mentioned PVs. I think this is a nice segue into perhaps my final question. For you before I bring in Fatin. Very quickly to both Fatu and to Edo. What new industries are your countries thinking about positioning themselves for? Of course, these JETPs are negotiated around financing, but a key element could also be non-financial support, technology transfer, skills generation, upskilling, knowledge transfer. So are there specific new industries, whether electric vehicles or batteries or solar PV manufacturing or a whole range of other things that your countries are actively considering? Fatu, do you want to go first, quickly, and then Edo?
So in renewable energy development, development of promotion of industries in the...
Sorry, just very quickly. Rudy has to attend another meeting, but we're very happy that he was able to join us for this long. Please, a round of applause for him. Thank you. Go ahead, Fatu. Sorry to interrupt.
So it will be very important to develop a local content in that, promoting, for example, the renewable energy, the development of industries, solar panel industries, development of, in the universities, for example, of renewable department, and maybe incentives for business owners to invest. And this must be very important. Develop content on this so the opportunity will stay in the countries. Also, one other thing is energy storage. The technology of storage must be implemented in our countries. Developing renewable energy without storage capacity is quite difficult. So we have to work on these technologies. Also, green hydrogen. We are discussing about green hydrogen. Technology of green hydrogen must be also in transportation sector, electric vehicles and others. So we will gain a lot in having this energy, this technology transfer and developing small businesses or big businesses that will impact our economies. So JETP must be an economic development opportunity. If we see it as an economic opportunity by developing businesses, by reinforcing people through universities, through communities, it will be very interesting both for climate and for economic development.
And Edo?
Yeah, we're quite lucky that Indonesia is also endowed with some of the critical components for renewable energies like nickel, bauxite, nickel especially. And the thing is, it has, like, one of the principles here is that Indonesia is attractive, provided these endowments. We used to be coal-based, now we move to renewable energy, then we also have nickel, one of the largest in the world, for instance. Then, but we want to have, as like Fatou said, added value there. Because this is a lesson that we all that have learned development, the history of development for the past 100 years or so, and then, like, it's always the case, like whatever, resource curse. I think this is time to also make sure that we developing countries can benefit from our resources, meaning that the contribution of transitioning toward low carbon economy has to provide added value to us. That's the most important thing. And in terms of technology, like just an example, nickel, then it means batteries, right? And then electric vehicles. And you know, Indonesia is attractive even in terms of market. We believe that providing incentives, market mechanism would be the best way to go. But you know, local content, so to say, in the broadest definition, is important, and added value. Otherwise, no country can break the resource curse, no matter. It used to be oil. Now the resource curse could be the critical items for that are critical for renewables, and we have to cut that. And no, it doesn't matter. Indonesia, Senegal, South Africa. So that's the thing. You know, the part of this technology, it could become anything, and of course it's human capital. It's the added value. You know, because as I said, we have to be together. And it's like win-win-win. Everybody gets the benefit. Everybody gets the slices of the pie.
Great. Now I want to bring in Faten to kind of conclude this panel discussion before we open up for questions and answers. And Faten, we're going to zoom out a bit and also look forward towards COP27 and beyond. And the question then is, say all of this were to succeed, and we hope it does, because all of the elements are there, the political will, the ownership, the commitment, time-bound objectives, an investment plan is being developed, consultations are happening, all of those were ticking all the boxes here. We then have to think of the future of climate negotiations, because this is an interesting approach. A lot of us are excited about the JETP because it's quite different, meaning that we have other processes that have been underway for years or decades, and they've not been as effective. The most evident one being the $100 billion promised in 2009, which is not materialized. And with that, then the broader question of multilateral processes and fora, the fact that they're not really delivering as they should be. So a successful JETP for South Africa and potentially for Senegal and Indonesia, what does that really mean for the future of climate negotiations? Does it mean that these established multilateral processes start to become, I don't want to say redundant, as a strong word, but people start pulling away from them? And then another question therefore is, what happens to the smaller countries, the more vulnerable countries that are not as influential as South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal, and others?
Yeah, thanks, Zainab, for those questions. I think what the negotiations around the JETP did, and the South African JETP in particular, is that they allowed us to highlight the real economy implications of this transition. And I think so far the way the generally the UNFCCC process has been approached has been very much environmentally focused. That's the nature of how the entire process started. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is that countries are becoming more and more critical and asking actually for the scope of the discussion actually to be broadened. Because this is not about only delivering on or addressing environmental concerns. It's certainly for the global south, and not only. I think let's also say it, that for a lot of even the northern economies, and we see it now as a result of these reversals since the war in Ukraine. It is about the economy. It's about socioeconomic impact, and I think it's good, and I think that's one of the major contributions of the South Africa JETP deal into the conversations. Now, I think South Africa, Indonesia, the higher emitters. Compared to the rest of the global south, are perhaps a special case. I think they're attractive because of the potential of those deals to have a major impact in terms of emissions. But I think, as you rightly mentioned, we shouldn't forget that for the majority, if we take Africa, for the majority of African countries, they're not high emitters. They're in fact quite low emitters. And so how do we address their concerns and make sure that we support the transition is quite important. Now, that logic or the argument that we often hear that South Africa is attractive because it's a high emitter is rather short-sighted, I would say. What we see is that in terms of patterns of emissions, if one looks at future patterns, because also of the growth of population in Africa, I think unless we start putting measures actually to support these countries to have a planned transition, not a sudden one, but a planned transition, a planned just transition, in order to avoid these long-term impact or long-term, it would be difficult, I think, later on to come back financially and have these large deals. I think it's much more cost efficient, in fact, to help the countries, in the case of most of the continent, to leapfrog. I mean, on issues such as energy access, we're really talking of leapfrogging. We're not necessarily talking of a full transition. And so that's easier to do, I think, at this point, than wait 10 years down the line, where we know from the data that exists now that the situation, in the next 20 to 30 years, or 10 to 30 years, it would be very, very different. Perhaps just one point also on the 100 billion. I think we know that the 100 billion is far below the trillions that are required to tackle climate change globally, and certainly in the global south. And so I think we need to open the discussion a bit more beyond the 100 billion. It's not about the 100 billion, it's about what is required for the countries to transition. And that is a much more systemic question, I think, that we need to deal with than pumping in 100 billion of climate money. It's about the climate finance. It's also, and some of it is handled within the UNFCCC, but we need to take into account the fact that some of the solutions actually don't sit with the UNFCCC. Many of them, in fact, would sit in the WTO. The trade-related measures, the technology transfer measures would sit within the WTO processes. And so we need to start broadening a bit the discussion just to allow countries as well to also take a bit more ownership and agency to facilitate the transition.
Very interesting. So just to conclude right now, before we open up quickly, and I guess this is a very, very broad question. You know, we are talking about JETP, we're talking about financing, we're talking about the transition plans of different countries. These are very much, I would say, domestic, regional processes, but they're all happening within a larger global context in which there's a lot of uncertainty. There's the war in Ukraine. We are still slowly emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. You mentioned the WTO as a multilateral organization where some kinds of negotiations happen, but we also know that the major economies, number one, number two, and perhaps number three, and number four, all have some kind of trade tensions going on, and even some trade wars happening, meaning that the ability of different countries and entities to come together becomes even more difficult. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this global macro environment might complicate things even further, or could even provide new opportunities.
I think we already see it. I think we already see this global tensions having a major impact. In fact, stalling progress, I would say, in climate negotiations. We've seen what happened at the G20, both the finance minister meeting as well as the final communique. That we're seeing what's happening with loss and damage, the loss and damage negotiations. We're seeing what's happening in terms of commitments around finance, where some are pointing the fingers to others, and one needs to be frank that when it comes to Africa, we're kind of sitting in between this, the firing line, so to speak, and it's not constructive. I think the impact is already there. I think there are two things perhaps to highlight in this respect is that we're seeing a decline in proper multilateralism and an increase in unilateralism and plurilateralism. Which is risky. I think it's risky from the point of view of climate action, climate justice in particular. We're seeing some regions taking unilateral measures around, carbon border taxes, with some that might follow. The US is discussing it. We understand Japan is discussing it. And so that kind of a plurilateralist approach is actually dangerous, I would say, for the global South, be it for Africa, be it for South America and other parts of the world. And the second point that I think is important to highlight is that we've seen the risk of geopolitical shifts in shaping the agenda around the transition. We see already, because of the situation in Europe, that there is a reversal almost, and really I would say mixed signals in terms of is it decarbonization or is gas remaining a central source of energy, and a certain level also of incoherence between the short-term demand and more the long-term policy that will enter into that will come into force, or that is currently in pipeline for discussions. And there's a great deal of incoherence between the short term and the medium to long term policy discussions. And I think for African countries, I think the risk is, the financial, particularly ability to respond very quickly is not the same as, let's say, what Europe would have or what the US would have. So calculating our short-term decisions, in terms of how fast do we go with the transition, should not be based on similar assumptions as the EU. And perhaps just a last point, Zainab, if you'd allow me, I think inevitably this entire, the current situation, the possible financial crisis that might come, will have an impact on the financing promises and ability also of international partners to strike attractive deals with African countries, for African countries themselves to have attractive financing with attractive terms to facilitate that transition. And I think we need to really start thinking about how do we cushion that, but also how do we think about the international financial system to make sure that it is really, it's fit for purpose, not just for the few, but for the majority of countries around the world. Because when it comes to climate, we're really talking about the global common good, as was said earlier. And we need to start thinking of solutions as global common goods.
Great, thank you very much, Faten. Now we're going to open up for questions. I think we have about 20-25 minutes. We'll probably start from people in the room and then we'll go online. I think we have a few that have come in and I'm waiting for our colleagues to send the questions via email. So we have, yes, the gentleman over there, please tell us your name. I think your mic is not on. Okay. Oops. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yes.
Is it not working? Sorry. It seems like it's in my... Let's try this one. Okay, can you hear me now? Right.
Yes.
I just wondered if, for some African countries, clearly, perhaps the bigger challenge is the transition in and not the transition out. Particularly those, without high carbon industrial sectors. I think we heard in the previous sessions today that 80% of African exports are commodities, and so the model is still a predominantly extractive one. And if we roll forward and we think about cobalt from DRC, the copper belt, other commodities needed for the transition, at the moment there's no economic model that looks beyond a mainly extractive one for that. And what then, if the risks around, and we're moving to a future where there'll be more mining, not less mining as well. So less coal mining, but more mining generally, is how do we lower the risk and ensure that that element of the transition is also just. And if you look at where the money comes from for commodity trading and commodity mining, it's largely private, large companies involved, and where do you see? And also, if you think that 51% of the world's copper is smelted in China at the moment, these are very global supply chains that depend on free trade. We know also that the war in Ukraine that you mentioned, one of the factors sitting behind it is access to rare earth metals. And some of the geopolitics that play out there are also driven by some of these transition commodities. So I'm just interested, as we think about the geopolitics and the African continent, does it also make sense to include the transition in element as well as the transition out? Thank you.
Okay. We're going to take maybe two more. Anyone else? Emmanuel? Please use the microphone.
Well, thank you. But it's just a comment, actually, just a short comment following from the first comment, and also, since currently I'm sitting with Irene, who made this yesterday. And it's to Senegal and countries of that same level in Africa, that the framing of the problem and the JETP processes will be very, very important. And I think Irene suggested some kind of thinking around a green socio-economic development pathway as the framing. Because in reality, there's no carbon to transition from. That's the truth on the matter. So for me, that's one of the key takeaways from this conference, that for countries like Senegal and those countries who basically have really nothing in terms of carbon to transition from, it's important to think about how you frame. Because one of the things that I'm worried about, and I hope the lessons from this conference helps, is that if you listen to the conversation in a lot of these countries around energy transition, it's really about having plans, to transition from carbon. And you ask yourself, what are you transitioning from? But if you begin to think at it in terms of the way South Africa has framed the JETP, then it should be about, following from the first comment, how does a country like Senegal move into this next phase, from where it is currently. And I think Irene's suggestion of a green development pathway, for me, will be one of the ways in which to think about this for a country like Senegal and those type of countries.
Okay, great. Any other question? Okay, that gentleman over there. I'll go online after this. No, it's not working. Have to. Great, it's on now.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, Emerson Clark from the Global Wind Energy Council. A simple yet potentially controversial one. How would the panel respond to certain skepticism around JETP being a trade deal in disguise?
Okay, so let's take those three and then we'll go to the questions I just received from our online audience. First one on transition in, not out. I don't know, maybe Edo wants to take that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that because well, we have something transition from. So the thing is, like, I fully agree that each country is different. Yes. Even in terms of the energy, like even South Africa and Indonesia, South Africa is having more like energy deficit situation, and Indonesia is the opposite. So the context of the JETP, contextualizing the JETP for South Africa and Indonesia should not be the same, because even the fundamentals of the energy situation between these two countries is not the same to start with. So I think it's really important to have this idiosyncratic approaches, and yeah, especially if you have nothing to transition from. Yeah. So it has to be something different, and this is our challenges for all of us. Right, and we may not. I mean, like the approach that is done by South Africa or currently, from Indonesia and Senegal, we can't just copy paste, use the same template. We have to own it. I mean, each country has to own, depending on their own situation.
Fatu, you want to take the green industrialization rather than decarbonization? I think is what Emmanuel is saying. That's how the problem should be framed for a lot of African countries in particular, which are not high emitters, including Senegal.
Yes, I agree at some point, but I think Senegal, energy sector, we are always transitioning from coal to oil discovery, from renewable technologies, but this transition is different. Senegal will transition, and the African country also, transitioning from an energy system based on fossil fuels, costly one, to integrating renewable energy, to using gas, and also transitioning from energy policies for 5 years to long-term strategies that include objective in reducing carbon and also integrating energy efficiency technologies. This is, for me, a transition. Having access, transitioning from not having access to electricity for population to universal access based on sustainable energy is a transition. So African countries, Asian countries, all countries have their own specific context, but they're all transitioning. And also, the energy transition is a global challenge. And we have our part of this challenge. And I believe that we are transitioning, and the world is transitioning. So I agree with you that we need to have our own frame, but it is really a transition, historical, I will say transition.
And then the final question, JETP as a trade deal or not?
I think that's the first time I heard that JETP is a trade deal. I don't know why there would even be a skepticism on something that's not even a trade deal. Partly it's because even if you forget the word JETP, for example, if the Germans wanted to give South Africa €1 billion for concessional finance, we have to have a pipeline of projects, and it would go via a KfW, like it's happening in the past, where a particular pipeline of either renewables or coal plants were financed through the normal mechanisms. The JETP is just a framework to try to locate new sets of investments in line with a more cleaner energy transition. So I wouldn't say it's a trade deal. There would be maybe other issues that would emerge later on, where certain companies like EDF or you deal with a lot of wind companies like Vestas. There might be specific trade rules that would govern those investments in country. So I would separate it. I don't. Deepak, have you heard it was a trade deal?
No, I haven't heard that it's a trade deal. Zainab, with your permission.
Sure, go ahead. Please, can you tell our audience who you are so they know?
I'm Deepak Patel, and I head up the climate finance function as well as innovation at the Presidential Climate Commission. That's an interesting take. And if we want to talk about trade, let me just say that our own just transition framework, firstly, but the emerging investment plan is very alive, in fact, to the trade risks associated with not making this transition. A number of speakers have talked about CBAMs. In our particular case, our entire mining and industrial complex is dependent on energy input in the form of either hydrocarbon-based liquid fuels or electricity, which we know are both very heavily sourced from fossil fuel sources. Now, as CBAMs come into existence, in fact, trade becomes a risk for us for all of those materials. The second point I wanted to make is that in terms of our own JETP, people might ask why electric vehicles? And electric vehicles precisely because we've located South Africa through a motor industries development program which has seen OEMs, Ford, VW, BMW, Daimler Chrysler, all setting up very capital-intensive assembly processes in South Africa which employ, in fact, just as many people directly as our coal industry. And the supply chains, which are high-value supply chains in those industrial parts of the country, run the risk, essentially, in fact, literally falling off the cliff when the EU decision taken in June this year bans the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles in 2035. So we're very much alive in the context of our investment plan, in context of our JETP. Why, for South Africa, we've tailored it with a particular bias. And it is, in fact, trade risk that presents if we do not make the transition that is driving the contours of what we consider to be essential for our transition.
Okay, so we have received a number of questions online. I think we have about 6. And in the interest of time, I'll just read all of them and then see how we can share them among the panel, starting with Faten. So the first one is, it's a lot actually. So the first one is, it says, you speak of countries without clout. I think that's probably to me. What are the key aspects of this clout that you mention? And what specific clout or aspects of it did South Africa use to negotiate the JETP? Maybe Salim, and yeah, you can address that question. So the second one is on, so the person says, transition literally means power to the people. How do we address this transition through SME, community power production, through microgrids and renewable and alternative energy options? And the third one is, whilst the transition to green growth aspect of the JETP is clear, are there any key takeaways for climate adaptation efforts in low-income countries from this experience? A fourth one, specifically for Edo, what model should be in place for energy to be affordable? How are we supposed to own the energy for it to be just? And then what is the initial Indonesian ownership model, and is electricity affordable? Number 5 is, can the panelists discuss what policy or member state position factors explain why the African Union climate change strategy remains in a draft form and has not yet been formally adopted? I don't know if we can address that question, but maybe Faten could help us on this front. And then the final one is, I understand that we need money, but we're not continuing with the dependence on rich countries without curating our... So, are we not continuing the dependence on rich countries without curating our own future? Is the money we're negotiating for grants or loans? Is the JETP financed to address national interests? And then what are the interests and who is driving them? So maybe I can start with the question on clout. I guess what I mean is, look, the reality is not, there are low-income countries. There are countries with an economy which is probably $5 billion. There are things that kind of country can achieve, but the reality is a country with a much larger economy, a larger population, probably has more leverage and can push and argue for certain things with development partners and with external partners. So that is what I mean by clout. And that it's not a coincidence we're seeing the JETPs, the one that exists right now with South Africa, and the ones under discussion, underway, all of them are with middle-income countries. So all this to say that we don't want those who, for some reason, are not able to get all of these partners, development partners in one room to say, we also want our JETP. We don't want those countries to be left behind. I think that's really the point that I was trying to make. So let's start with Faten. Faten, any of those questions you want to address?
Yeah, certainly, Zainab. Maybe just very quickly on the African Union climate strategy, it has been adopted in February this year. I'll just post the link online. I see the question, so I'll post the link online, but both the strategy and the action plan were adopted. I just wanted to go back, perhaps, if you allow me, Zainab, on this question on transitioning in. While we're speaking, or rather than speaking of transitioning out. And I wanted to, I think I would agree certainly with the premise that, and I see some comments also in the chat on that, on the need to avoid falling again in the trap of an extractive logic, because Africa is host to, or holds a lot of reserves of CRMs. I think that discussion, certainly in the African continent, isn't new. We've been trying for quite some time to, even with previous discussions before this one came along, to speak about value addition to natural resources. And the issue has always been limitations in terms of industrialization. often the question is, you know, if you take certain agricultural products, the question that we often had is, but what's the market to consume it? I think we're to some degree in a different situation now with the energy transition. I think when it comes to the production of or adding value, or facilitating integration into the supply chain, I think we are in a better position than where we were. And I say that because one, I think COVID kind of accelerated the discussion on diversification of supply chain. But also, you know, when we speak of manufacturing, to avoid positioning it in one geography. And I think we have an opportunity there to capitalize on that. I think there is the labor market in Africa is, I think, much more. It would be in a better position, I think, than other parts of the world, and I think the opportunity is there to be grabbed. I think the challenge is more how do you design those policies and think of it really regionally. I mean, we see some initiatives coming up, for instance, around cobalt with DRC and Zambia looking at a joint processing. The processing of cobalt there locally. I think potential to link it with other parts of, you know, be it manufacturing in South Africa, etc. Are interesting idea, but I think we need to move forward in implementing them. But I think it will all hang on, you know, depend on how far we go with the discussion on green industrialization and capitalizing really on the regional value chains there.
Salim?
Just to, I think there was a question on finance, I can't remember.
Yes, I mean, there are so many questions.
I think Edo also wants to answer.
There's also one for Edo specifically.
Affordability?
Yeah. You want to answer it?
Yeah, sure. When we talk about, well, I talk about this energy security and affordability, and then what kind of model, what kind of, you know, it's all about, it all comes to make sure that we reach the balance. Because when we say affordability, there is one necessary condition that has to be met. We have to make sure that the suppliers of this energy can afford the prices that they pay for the energy generation. So what I'm trying to say is, like, we have to look both the supply and the demand here. So it has to be, yes, it has to be affordable for the people, especially those the vulnerable societies, for instance. But we also have to make sure that, especially in the cases of many countries, I think including Indonesia and South Africa, we have to make sure that the supplier of this, ESCOM in the case of South Africa, PLN in the case of Indonesia, can also afford the purchase price, you know, pricing, and of course, if it is not yet affordable, then the way is to provide. I mean, this is like the traditional, conventional ways to provide, of course, fiscal support. It's either we provide support fiscal through for the supply side, the companies, normally state-owned enterprise, or the people with vouchers, everything. The ideal way going forward is the development of smart grids, and this is related to technology transfer, and it might take, well, not might, it will take some time, smart grids, so that we can have a more efficient use. And like for the case of Indonesia, it's not easy because we are an archipelagic country, and also related to that is the pricing. Yeah, in the end of the day is we have to make sure that, you know, because it's a necessary condition for the suppliers to be able to afford it. So we have to make sure that there is a balance so that it's attractive enough for the renewables to, you know, to come in, so we can get a massive deployment of renewables, but while at the same time, it's affordable enough. And this is a challenge, actually, for countries that possess the technology. So they have to be able to bring down the level of the prices of the renewables, so that it could, I mean, it has been excellent. I mean, the past few decades, bringing down the cost of the renewable energy sources, but it has to be able to be transferred to the developing countries who currently don't really possess the technology. So they have to come also bring down the price, and then it will be affordable for everyone. Because if the suppliers cannot afford, and then there is lack of fiscal space at the government level, at the macro level, then it won't be affordable for the people. So this is all interrelated. So we can't just give the responsibility like only for the government. You have to do this, the state-owned enterprise, the supplier. It has to be with everything, including the countries that possess the technology.
Right, so we are running out of time, and what I think we'll do is we'll just ask all our panelists to give closing remarks, and if there's anything from any of the questions you immediately want to address in like 20 seconds, if possible, please do, and then give your concluding remarks. Let me start with Fatou.
Thank you so much, Zainab. The question about relying on investment from rich country, I think that it's a partnership. And it's a global challenge, and we won't see it as relying on other countries, but as a global partnership. We are here to achieve one goal relating to the climate change issue. And investment from rich country, as it was said, is not is a win-win partnership. Everyone will gain into this partnership. The final word is to thank you for this initiative, and I think we will continue with the African Climate Foundation to exchange, to learn together, and to reach all those great objectives. Thank you.
Great. Before I turn to both Faten and Salim, Edo, any final remarks?
Just very short. I think this has been exciting. These are exciting times. Just energy transition provides the promise, that we hope that everyone can deliver from all sides, so that we can move towards a more sustainable economy going forward. However, I think we need to, all the different countries have to also, promote this conversation among us, because the process has to be country-owned, country-led, and it has to serve the interest of our interest, the developing countries, so that we can get, we can develop, we can industrialize while following the low carbon pathways. And there is no one pathway. There are plenty of pathways depending on our situation in each country.
Wonderful. Faten?
Yeah, I think what I will say from my end, and maybe building on what Fatou said, is that what we're seeing is that, be it South Africa, which is a front runner in a very innovative and yet very complex process, or be it the rest of, the African continent, all the African countries that are, in fact, taking leadership, I would even argue, for the global common good, despite the historical, the fact that they're historically insignificant contributors, and still saying, look, we're keen to put forward ambitious NDCs, despite the difficulties that we will have. I think that needs to be recognized. But as Fatou said, this needs to be in a partnership mode, and that partnership has to bring added value. It cannot be a partnership that is one-sided. And I think if we succeed in doing that, I think there's some hope, at least for future, for proper solution that is just for everybody.
And Salim?
First, to thank you, Zainab, for hosting this event jointly with us. And I think the insight I can only share is that we can use the momentum of JETPs to really build a program of leadership and activity, but also change the fundamentals of the real economy. And I've never seen something like that ever nurtured within the continent, now being taken up in many parts of the continent. And I think that's really exciting. I think you would agree UNFCCC is boring, you know, they fight over words. We want to do real things, so this is really the opportunity for us to take charge of that. Thank you very much.
On that controversial note, I didn't say it, he did.
I can say it.
No, but on a serious note, thank you very much, everyone. This has been very enlightening, very insightful to me, to a lot of people here, but also to a lot of people around the world. We actually got about 10 more questions online. We just cannot go through all of them. But this also shows the interest in the topic and the necessity of having these dialogues, providing this information to people. People are hungry for information, but they're also hungry for solutions.
And
I
critical.
think, yes, exactly, and that is all good. We just need to have these dialogues more often that are solutions-oriented. On that note, I would like to thank the panelists for making the time. I would like to thank our audience here. Very importantly, I would like to thank the Africa Climate Foundation for co-hosting this session, or allowing us to co-host this session in this 2-day workshop. And obviously, a lot of work has gone behind the scenes to make this a success. The team at the Carnegie Africa program, Juliet Ovadia and a couple of others, but also the team at the Africa Climate Foundation, Francis, Kelly, Nazira, and a couple of others. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful day.
There's drinks.
There's drinks.